My guest today is Ingrid, whom I'll just refer to by first name at her request, and she is the founder of secondhalftravels.com, an early retirement travel blog that focuses on practical advice for language learning related travel. Ingrid early retired in 2016 at the age of 43 after a career in software engineering, where she worked for over a decade at a large Silicon Valley headquartered technology company. Post early retirement, she has focused her time primarily on language learning, long-term travel through 57 countries, and writing. Her stated early retirement goal is to learn a new language to at least conversational fluency every 2 years through in-country language immersion courses. She's now done this with Spanish, Portuguese, and French, having enrolled in language courses in 7 different countries, and next on her list is Russian. I invited Ingrid to the podcast to share about her FIRE journey and what she's reflected on over the years since, as well as practical advice for new and aspiring early retirees who are interested in pursuing long-term travel in early retirement. Ingrid, it's great to host you. Thanks so much for joining us to share your insights on early retirement.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, if I understand correctly, you were working a good, stable job in software engineering in a major global, prestigious technology company. What made you want to and ultimately decide to leave a good engineering job for early retirement?
Well, I guess that's kind of a longer story. I got into software engineering a little late, so I started a master's in computer science when I was 27. My undergraduate degree was not in computer science. And when I finished undergrad, I wasn't sure what to do with my life. So moving to London sounded like a good idea. So I moved to London for 3 years and worked a lot of temporary jobs, saving money for travel. And I did a lot of trips to Asia and the Middle East and also around the UK and Europe. And after that, after 3 years, I came back to the States and got a job as an editor and writer, which was kind of my dream job, but it was pretty underpaid. And I would say that particular job was also exploitative. So I wanted to make more money and wanted more freedom to travel. And this was like the late 90s, the time of the dot-com boom. So programming sounded like a great option. And my mom was a programmer. My dad was a computer science professor. So it was very easy for me to imagine myself in that job. And there was a special master's program through the University of Texas system for people that didn't have a technical background. So you could do a year's worth of basically a condensed undergrad degree and then launch into your master's courses for 2 years. So the whole thing took 3 years full time. So I started working in software engineering when I was 30 with a bunch of 22-year-olds. And after a couple of years with a smaller company, I moved on to a large tech company, like you mentioned. I actually had a job that was pretty perfect for me. I worked for an internal consulting unit where we were contracted out to the different business units of the company. So my projects would change radically every 6 months, year, 2 years. So it's kind of a fantastic way of having a multitude of different jobs within the same job. There was a lot of variety. I started off doing .NET coding. I ended up doing Android app development. So we were constantly being trained and learning new skills. So that part was very cool. I like coding. Coding is very creative. A lot of people that aren't coders think it's like boring, like you're just typing at a keyboard, but it's very creative. It's like solving a puzzle. It's very engaging. But, you know, as anyone who's worked as a software engineer or who's worked in corporate America knows, and there's a lot more to it than just the skills of the job. What I didn't like was, you know, the mismanagement. Sometimes there was bad decision making on the part of the management that really caused a lot of stress for the employees. And I think I just have a personality where I fundamentally need to be in control of my own time. And so working for a big company wasn't a good fit for me. But I do think software engineering is a great profession for people who love to learn. It's nonstop, but it can also be stressful. So I always said I'd retire by 45. That was the number that I kind of had in my head. And then because the stock market did so well, thankfully, I retired 2 years early at 43.
Excellent. Was there a moment when you realized you had to early retire, or was it just like stock market has cleared the threshold I needed to clear, so it's time to go?
That's a good question. So my last year, I was fortunate to join an experimental new division at my company where you could completely choose your own schedule and completely choose your own projects. So it was like a dream come true. And I told them I wanted to work 3 months on, 3 months off. And then I chose the projects that I wanted to, because previously I hadn't had that much leeway. I was kind of placed on whatever was highest priority. And I said, I really want to do web development because I've never really been allowed to do that. So it was a great combination. I still had full benefits despite being half-time. And I would use my 3 months off to travel, and I'd come back to work and it was like my soul was dying there. I think it was weird before, because when you're working full time, you're kind of in the groove, and things are like you're just kind of used to it, you know. And then but when you step out of it, even for a little while, you get this new perspective, and it becomes very hard to come back. So that 3 month on, 3 month off schedule ended up being like kind of what turned the tide for me. And so I left what for a lot of people would probably have been a dream position, because I already had enough. I knew that I had enough. It was just like taking that final plunge. And so at the end of that year, I did that.
Got it. So, I was gonna ask, like, once you kind of came to that realization, like, well, what was the plan you formulated and put into action to make it happen? But it actually sounds like you had already reached that point. It was more of a mindset shift. The logistics were already like complete, so to speak. How did you know that?
Um, well, I wanted to be sure my nest egg would last forever. And I was willing to sacrifice a few more years of my life at my job to make 100% sure that I had enough. Because tech skills get outdated pretty quickly. And so I thought, if I left my software engineering job, it would be a one-way street. That was how I saw it. It wasn't I wanted to make sure I didn't have to go back to work in the future. So if I left for a few years, it would have been difficult for me to come back in. It would have been impossible for me to come back in at the same level that I was at. So I was concerned that a 4% withdrawal rate would be too aggressive, because my retirement could potentially be 50, 55 years. The women in my family tend to live into their 90s. So
That's amazing, by the way.
so retiring at 43, I potentially had another 50, 55 years ahead of me, more than half my life possibly. So I went for a 3% withdrawal rate, and that was including discretionary expenses like travel. But I could get that down to 2% if I had to tighten the belt and not travel. So I also logged my expenses for 8 years before retiring. So I had a really good idea of what my living expenses would be. I paid off my house completely the year before I retired. So my housing costs became very low. I lived and still lived in a low cost of living area. And I planned to stay here once I retired. So there weren't going to be a lot of big changes except for adding things like healthcare insurance. I was fortunate that my employer had completely paid for health insurance, but I just priced all that out using the healthcare exchange and kind of estimating how healthcare costs might grow in future. I ran scenarios through FireCalc, and then I always keep a couple of years expenses in cash, so that if there's a market downturn, I don't need to dip into my investments.
Got it. Interesting. So it sounds like there was like a pretty methodical way to come up with your fire number. Did you have the 3 and 2% in mind, all like as the target? And that's sort of what you are working toward. And I guess one question related to that is, would love to understand how you, I guess, internalize the confidence that, projecting over 55 years, a long time, lots of things can change. The world can change. The world looked very different 55 years ago. how did you get the confidence that your expense structure would virtually withstand any scenario, no matter how your expenses might change? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think the 3% withdrawal rate and really 2% that I knew that I could get down to if I took out the travel. I felt that 2% was very rock solid, even considering like any kind of crazy scenarios that might come down the pipe. I also thought that in an emergency situation, I could possibly still go back to work in some capacity. Um, I didn't expect when I retired for the blog ever to earn income. That has just been kind of gravy for me. But it makes sense now looking back that when a relatively young person retires, they have a lot of energy and passion, ways they want to contribute to the world. And it makes sense that in some way that's going to end up generating income.
Hmm. Um, what is your withdrawal rate now? Has it held up to the 3 or 2?
Yeah, well, my net worth has pretty much followed the market since 2016, so it's pretty much doubled. So my withdrawal rate is now less than 2%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I just sweep the dividends to a money market account and I use that in the blog income to live off of. I still have a pretty frugal existence.
What's your overall asset allocation?
It's about 80% stocks in REIT funds and 20% bonds. And the stocks are a mix of Vanguard Total Stock Market Index and International. So pretty much all my investments are at Vanguard and always have been.
Got it. So it sounds like mostly like passive diversified index funds, not individual companies.
Exactly. Yeah, I've never invested in individual funds. When I worked for my company, they had stock grants and also an employee stock purchase plan, and I participated in both of those. But as soon as like we had the ability to buy the stocks, I would do a quick sale and then immediately convert them to, Vanguard taxable index fund.
Got it. Okay, cool. So you mentioned obviously also are earning some revenue from your blog. If the earnings are a material percent of your kind of regular spend, what percent of your spend at this point would you say is derived from blog earnings versus portfolio withdrawal?
I would say a little less than half my living expenses. So yeah, when I started the blog, it was really just for family and friends. But then when I started blogging about learning Spanish, the posts started to get some readers because obviously learning Spanish is a popular pastime in the US and Canada. And I took a couple of search engine optimization courses, SEO courses, and I also invested in a keyword research tool. I think if you have a software technical background, SEO is pretty straightforward and fun. It's just optimization. and once I started to apply those techniques, then traffic really started to take off and it got to the point where I could monetize it. The income is mostly from ads. So I have an ad management agency called Mediavine that is very popular among bloggers because of their generous payments. And they also kind of bend over backwards to support their publishers in other ways, like make sure we're compliant with different privacy requirements around the world. So I love Mediavine. I also make money off affiliate links, mostly Amazon.
Got it. Okay, cool. So, and when you say that your blog income is maybe a little bit less than half of your regular withdrawal or regular spending needs rather, and a moment ago you said that the market's doubled, so now your spend rate is probably dipped below 2. Is that excluding the blog income? So if you were to include it, actually be way lower than even that, or is it actually all in?
That is including the blog income. Yeah, because
Okay.
actually, with the blog income, at the end of the year, when I declare it on taxes, I take a bunch of deductions. So that's really nice that I can deduct my language learning materials that I review. I can obviously deduct any software and hosting of the blog, any training that I do. I always have a long list of expenses that are related. And then I put what's left into a solo 401k.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Those are powerful for solopreneurs. Um, you mentioned that there was some point where you were sort of consciously growing traffic. It sounds like you took an SEO course and you invested in the keyword tool. So those are pretty strategic moves to make. What was I guess the light bulb moment when you thought that doing these things would result, like you already had early indications of promise that uh, readers or users would be interested in this material, so it's like really a good idea to actually double down. Like were you just like naturally writing blog posts about language learning and noticing that they were doing well and then double down, or was it more abstract, I guess?
I think the light bulb moment for me was when I started to join Facebook groups for bloggers. So before that, I'd kind of just been out on my own doing my own thing. And I remember reading, there's a female travel blogger, and she wrote about this group for female bloggers on Facebook. And I was like, oh. And so I started joining all these communities. And then I realized, there's so much more to blogging than what I was doing, and that I could really take it to the next level. And then in the course of learning about SEO, you do learn about playing your strengths. So the 80-20 rule applies in blogging just like it does everything else. So 20% of your posts bring 80% of your traffic. In my case, I think it's like 5 posts bring 75% of my traffic. So you kind of you learn to what Google likes you for, and then you play to those strengths. You write more content on those subjects. And then you can use those posts kind of to direct traffic on your site to other posts that you might want to get more traffic. They're very useful. They're kind of workhorse posts that you really want to maintain and keep evergreen.
So like, I guess what I'm curious about is like, for example, did you have one post that maybe you stumbled upon that happened to do very well, and then you were thinking, man, how do I create more like these? Or did you already have that strategic mindset shift and then almost like try to anticipate out and plan out what posts would do really well? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think I did have that strategic mindset. I did notice the trend of what was doing well as far as, Spanish learning. And then when I took my first SEO course, that was one of the the core pieces of advice that they gave is you really need to dig into your statistics and look at what's getting the traffic, and then build on that and write related posts. So in some sense I was already doing that, but it really kind of validated my observation and made me a lot more determined
Yeah.
to pursue that strategy.
Okay, awesome. I'd love to shift a little bit and talk about kind of the early retirement experience. What was your original plan for early retirement? Like, how did you envision spending your time? How do you actually spend your time now that you're in retirement?
I always knew I wanted to travel. I've loved to travel. I've loved languages since I was a kid. And I always had the dream of writing, doing art and photography. And my retirement has turned out pretty much exactly as I expected, devoting myself to those interests, with the exception of the pandemic, which I think blindsided everyone. I do think it's really important to have something to retire to, a plan, even if you don't end up doing that exact same thing. And preferably maybe some hobbies that you've had a chance to develop already and that are part of your life.
Hmm.
So yeah, before the pandemic, I traveled about 4 months a year, and that was like 3 international trips and a couple of domestic ones. And it was kind of like the hub and spoke model
Mm.
because I'm adventurous, but at the same time, I like having the security of a home base to go back to.
Mhm.
I would never want to be a digital nomad or a perpetual traveler 100% of the time with no permanent home. That doesn't appeal to me at all. And languages have always been really important to me. So German was my first language, and I was raised bilingual. I did my first language exchange to Mexico when I was 15, and then the year after that, I spent a year in German-speaking Switzerland. I always tried to fit in language travel and study, language study and travel when I was working, but when you work in a stressful job, you sometimes just don't have the energy and time for it.
Mhm.
But I did use my vacations for it. and I would take time off unpaid. I used to go to Spanish-speaking countries on my vacations and take classes and talk to the locals as much as possible. And when I was home, I would watch Spanish TV shows and listen to Spanish podcasts. Yeah, I just think language learning has always been a passion, and I feel really blessed that now I can devote myself to it with as much time as I want.
Have you been able to travel at least domestically since the pandemic?
I have not traveled since last March, even domestically. Well, in the last couple of weeks, I've done a couple of small road trips around home. Last February and March, I was in Brazil doing language study, and I got to experience Carnival in Rio, which was like a bucket list item for me. So I feel really fortunate that I was able to experience that. I came home at the beginning of March, and I haven't gone anywhere since then. So my travel plans last year were all canceled. I was going to study French in Quebec and in France, and I was going to go to an international language conference in Mexico, and all of that got postponed.
Got it. So language learning is a key motivation for sort of post-retirement travel. Um, and it sounds like, I guess I'm curious, like how you gravitated toward this type of travel, and maybe you could say a little bit more about why language learning courses as a motivation to travel is so important. I know that you mentioned that you've always loved languages. Maybe that the answer is as simple as that. I'm just curious, like it's a pretty conscious step, I think, to make that a focus of early retirement.
Yeah, I think there are other motivations besides just language learning, because you can learn languages very well at home and in some way more comfortably and cheaper. Just nowadays you can do one-on-one language classes online just over Zoom or Skype very easily. So I think the language learning really helps me to have a purpose to my travel. I've found that if I don't have that, for me over time, long-term travel can start feeling kind of pointless
Mm.
and alienating. I tend to get burned out on sightseeing after about a month. After a while, all the churches start to look the same, the temples start to look the same if you're in Asia. So I find language learning kind of gives the trip a structure. It gives you a purpose, and it also, which I think is very important, introduces an important social element.
Mhm.
So it makes it super easy to meet people through language schools. You can do a homestay with a local family. You're typically in class 4 hours a day with people from all over the world. And a lot of schools have social activities in the afternoons and evenings. They have excursions on weekends.
Mm.
So when you attend a language school, you're kind of slotting into this ready-made community, which is really great, especially if you're a solo traveler.
Mhm.
And it results in long-term friendships with other students, with homestay families, and even with teachers. So um, a lot of people end up going back to the same schools over and over just because of the relationships that they've made.
Oh wow, interesting. So do you see sort of boomerang students back, like in your own experience?
Yeah, it really depends on the school. Some schools have a really special vibe. The school that I went to in Rio that I just mentioned, I think had the strongest community of any school I've ever attended. And they had people that would return year after year. And they also were a kind of support network for local expats.
Mm.
So even people who had moved to Brazil and spoke Portuguese would continue returning to the school over and over, at least attending the social activities, just because it was like a part. Yeah, it was like a part of their social network. And the school also offered a lot of support for, navigating the bureaucracy of Brazil if you
Mm.
needed to get a visa and things like that.
Mm. Mm. How do you find a school and determine that it is good, and it has all of these sort of positive attributes that you've described?
I would, recommend, doing an internet search, looking at school reviews on TripAdvisor, on Yelp. There are also sites that are devoted just to language schools that have reviews. read those reviews, take them a little bit with a grain of salt, because schools have been known to manipulate reviews, but you can get a good feel for the school that way. Also, I would follow the school on social media and see what they're posting there. It gives you an idea of the activities that they do. And if they're posting helpful content on social media, that can be a good indication of how engaged they are. And then I would write to each school and ask them your questions, and then kind of see how responsive are they. So, usually after you write a few schools, you start to really get a feel for which one might be a good fit for you.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that you travel now 4 months out of the year, based on what you're describing, is it accurate to say that the enrolling in a school with all of the, I guess, support structure and social aspects that you described is really like the main focal point? You're not really doing sort of unrelated travel, too much of it anyway. Like it's you go there for the course, and then there might be some ancillary travel on the weekends, et cetera, et cetera. But really the course and the school is the main focus. Is that true, or is it something different?
Yeah, I would say it's generally the focus. Not always. I still do some travel that's not necessarily language related. Um, yeah, I would say the majority of it is language related now, just because, like I said, I found that more rewarding than just randomly going to a place and sightseeing. But if you do the kind of travel where you're not necessarily at a language school, there are still a lot of ways that you can connect with people if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One thing I like to do is small group day tours.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you pile into a van with a bunch of people and cruise around the countryside and visit places that would be impossible for me to get to on public transport. You can meet some really interesting people on those tours that you stay in touch with, and you can find those tours on TripAdvisor. And then there are English conversation meetups, or there were before the pandemic. They're very popular in big cities, in countries, where English is not the native language, but where people have really strong reasons for learning English. Like I've been to English conversation meetups in Moscow and Madrid, where there are hundreds of people that wanted to practice their English. And if you're a native speaker, you're kind of in demand. Like everyone wants to talk to you. And you get a lot of invitations to hang out over the next few days. They want to show you around. So it's a really nice way of connecting with locals who are eager to practice their English and have a new friend from the States.
Is safety ever an issue, or
Safety.
concern?
It's definitely a concern. Um, I think, yeah, over time you kind of learn, what to do. I think in my early 20s, there are a couple of kind of scary situations I got into in the Middle East and Asia that fortunately everything turned out fine. But now I'm a lot more cautious. I think too in Latin America, solo women can be the target of muggers more often than men. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you're meeting up with people, like for example, with Couchsurfing, which is another site I like to use,
Mm-hmm.
typically what I do, I don't look for accommodation on Couchsurfing because I just prefer to have my own place, my own Airbnb. But I'll write an intro and introduce myself, ask locals if they want to hang out, get a coffee, and walk around town. And usually a lot of people will write me and offer. And then, the cool thing about Couchsurfing is you can go in and look at all the reviews that other couch surfers have written that person. So even if, like say, a man writes me and wants to meet up, and I see that he has like 200 glowing reviews from other people, many other solo women travelers, talking about what a great person he is, then I feel very confident meeting up with that person. And I've done that a number of times. And even, I feel very comfortable even getting in their car and, going on a tour of, whatever neighboring city, whatever. It's never been an issue. But I do think you have to be alert and, be sure to read the fine print.
So folks will reach out to you the other way as well. Did I hear that correctly?
Um,
Or
yeah,
is it situations where all situations where you have reached out?
I will post an intro asking if anyone wants to meet up, and they will contact me. I have also occasionally contacted people directly
Hmm.
that I thought seemed interesting. Yes, you can do it either way.
Got it. Sorry, because I'm not familiar with Couchsurfing. I don't use it. It sounds like an intro is like a public announcement that multiple people can see. It's not like a one-on-one communication. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. So Couchsurfing is kind of originally was kind of a hippie bohemian site that was used, to find free accommodation for people that wanted to do a kind of cultural exchange. And it's morphed into a lot more than that. So yeah, like I said, I don't use it for accommodation, but it's great just for, I write a public intro. There's a page where you can do that. It's a page like people that are coming to your city or whatever. And so you put a
Hmm.
post on that page
Hmm.
and tell them the dates and, um, just introduce yourself. And then there are also official Couchsurfing meetups that have some overlap with the English conversation meetups I mentioned, because typically the locals that come to Couchsurfing meetups want to practice their English.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
those meetups can attract, yeah, several hundred people. And they can get, yeah, they're like big parties, basically.
Is the motivation for somebody to like meet up for a coffee or take you around locally, is it primarily because they want to practice English? I'm just trying to understand kind of from their perspective.
That's some of it. On Couchsurfing, you find a lot of people who want to be ambassadors for their culture. So they're very proud of where they live, and they want to show it to international visitors, and they also want to have more international friends. So it's a very kind of altruistic community.
Hmm.
I like that about it a lot, because money never exchanges hands.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's really just about culture exchange and learning about each other.
Speaking of money, like if you go around and do stuff, probably some small amount of spend is involved. What are the norms around that? Do you as the traveler typically offer to pay, or do people go Dutch? Like, are there norms that are used?
I think it depends on the dynamic. First of all, if you're in a culture that tends to have a tradition of chivalry, if you're with a man, perhaps, a lot of times he'll insist on paying. It also depends on your relative buying power, relative to the country where you are. I would pretty much always offer to pay, or at least go Dutch. And then, if they insist, no, no, you're my guest, then um, I don't argue or anything, but I try to, yeah, I, whenever I can, I try to make up for their hospitality in some way.
For female travelers, how do you, maybe this is just from your own experience, or if you've talked to others, how do you make sure that doesn't signal the wrong things that you may not intend? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think if you're meeting up with a guy one-on-one, you should probably stick to couch surfers who are tagged as being ambassadors on the site, and who literally have hundreds of glowing reviews. That would be my recommendations to avoid any kind of misunderstanding, because it can be used as a dating site, and that's fine. That's not what I use it for. But couch surfers who are experienced, um, they know the score, so they're not going to expect, no, they're not going to expect anything or get the wrong idea. There's lots of women traveling the world solo who just want to meet up in a platonic way. And I mean, for me personally, it's never been a problem. Everyone's always been really respectful.
Got it. That's good to know. Um, I was curious to learn a little bit more about the kind of the language learning aspect. So in these courses that you enroll in, do you find that I guess if you could comment a little bit like on the profile of the student body, are these like disproportionately study abroad college students or maybe graduate students, but they're like in school, and they're doing language for some purpose for school? Or is there more of a kind of representative of the population spread between students and learners who are later in life, maybe who are transiently traveling or early retired or even older, like they're actually just seniors retired, and that broadly represents the population? Like, is it skewed or is it kind of representative?
It varies widely depending on the location and on the time of year. So in summer in the Northern Hemisphere, you're going to find more young people everywhere. So that's a good time. It's the high season, Northern European and Northern American summer. So that's a good time to avoid if you have that possibility.
Mm,
Um, my experience has been really diverse. I mean, in Mexico at the Spanish language schools, it tends to be retired people from the US and Canada
mm,
predominantly at the schools outside
mm,
of summer, when you
mm,
would have more people that are student age. Um, in in Europe, it tends to skew a lot younger, um, even outside of summertime. So I
mm,
would say like the average age at my school in Madrid was maybe like late 20s.
mhm,
Um, but there were still people of all ages. There were retired people as well. So that's one thing I would recommend that you ask when you're writing the school. Ask them the average age in summer, outside of summer, um, and kind of get a feel from them, if you feel like you would be comfortable, with your age range.
mhm,
The schools that I went to in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, that was a really wide mix. I really enjoyed that a lot, and people from all over the world. I really, probably my favorite kind of demographic at a language school is truly diverse people from all over, and then a diverse mix of ages, because I just find that a lot more interesting.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, one thing, because the reason I ask this is because I imagine um, that, and I'm also just kind of curious to get your personal taste for this around, like, there's got to be, I imagine, like communities that form, sub communities that form within a student body, and probably one very natural demarcation line will be age. If you're in your 20s, you probably just have very different things to talk about than somebody in their 40s and somebody in their mid 60s, etc. And so, one, do you find that to be true? Two, do you find yourself just more naturally inclined to um, coalesce with folks who are just within striking distance of your own age, as opposed to hanging out with 20 somethings or 60 somethings?
I think the average 22-year-old that goes to a language school in, Brazil or in Madrid is maybe not your average 22-year-old. So it's somebody who's really interested in the world and other cultures. And yeah, maybe they probably like to go out more, late nights drinking than I do. That's fine. I just don't do those things in general. I have made friends kind of across all ages at language schools. I think you can meet people in their 20s that are really interesting and mature, just as well as you can meet people in their 60s. Um, I am excited when I meet someone sort of my age, 40s, because I feel like that age range is the least represented,
Mm,
because people in their 20s have free time. They typically don't have families yet. People that are retired, again, have free time to travel. So the 40-year-olds, I guess, are all working or raising kids. So I am happy to meet people my age, but I never felt any discrimination from anybody, just because I might be older than the average student. Everyone was always very friendly and open, and, asked me to hang out. So, I wouldn't worry about that at all.
mhm. Yeah, when I was years ago, when I was younger, I enrolled in a couple language courses myself. I do understand what you're talking about. Like, there is strong community. Everybody tends to be a little bit more open-minded because everybody's kind of a deer caught in the bright lights, and it's a new culture. And there's activities, etc. And some of my fondest memories of being abroad were in language schools, and I always kind of had this residual feeling like how could this continue, because it's sobering, right, to go back to like your office or whatever. um but then I thought, like, well, that's because I'm now in kind of in more in my 20s and don't have a family, kind of the way you described. But later I just assumed that the atmospherics would change, because if I'm older and their general demographic stays the same, like we just like our life paths are just different, right? Like at different points in time. And I hadn't sort of considered about, well, first of all, I guess different language schools may have different distributions. And also, anyway, it sounds like from your perspective, it's um, as much a mindset thing as it is an actual thing, because it sounds like you're pretty able to, you're pretty able to, pretty much able to, um, I guess, connect with different types of folks. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it's about being young at heart. In some ways, I might have more in common with someone in their 20s and 30s than someone, in their 60s and 70s. Um, yeah, I wouldn't worry about that at all with language schools. I mean, it tends to be very diverse and open-minded mix of people that are interested in talking to you. So the people that you meet at language schools are, basically feels like my tribe. you know, I really, I feel like it's very easy for me to make friends at language schools and find people I have things in common with. Another interesting observation I've made is that firees tend to be attracted to language schools. So makes sense. They have the time and they like to slow travel. So I have met several early firees in their 40s
Hmm.
and one even in his 30s at various language schools. They tend to be undercover, so they don't like come out and tell
Hmm.
you that they're fire.
Yes, of course.
But you sort of put the pieces together, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Uh, okay, cool. How do you handle healthcare in these, like, well, as an early retiree, when you're on the road, when you're in language schools, sort of all these scenarios?
Well, I have an HMO here at home that I get through the healthcare exchange. I'm glad that we still have Obamacare because it would be a lot harder for me to get health insurance without it. And it's not necessarily cheap, but I already knew that going into retirement, so I was prepared for that. Um, when I travel, I don't really worry too much. I get travel insurance that will cover emergency evacuation because that could be something that could be significantly expensive. But other than that, I mean, healthcare costs around the world are so much cheaper or free that I'm not really running a huge risk if I needed to go to the doctor.
Even
I
if
would
you're a foreigner, they charge you the same price or no price at all?
It might be a little more, but generally it's all still very reasonable. And in Europe, like their systems aren't even set up for charging, so they don't really know what to do. So they just treat you for free. Is what I've heard from people who've had health issues in Europe and had to go to the doctor.
Got it. So you budgeted all of that anyway as you were, preparing to fire, is that correct?
Yeah, I budgeted in the cost of health insurance, and then the travel insurance that I get for my trips is very cheap. There's a site called Square Mouth.
Hmm.
I usually pay about $14 for a 6-week trip or something like that.
Oh, wow. And that covers like emergency evac?
Correct. Yeah.
Got it. Um, so we were talking offline before the interview, and you were sharing a little bit about um, how emotional well-being, personality changes in early retirement. Uh, this is a topic that I hadn't really considered so deeply before. It's not often discussed. Just curious if you could comment more on what you mean by that and how does it change?
Yeah. That's been a really interesting kind of psychological experiment to see what happens when you're no longer working full time. You kind of yeah, you start to realize how much work has really impacted your personality. I've gone from being really type A and probably over planning everything down to the tiniest detail, to being more relaxed and spontaneous. I'm still a type A person for sure. That's just never going to change. I do think the pandemic has been good for learning to let go a little bit of control, realizing that we humans are not always in charge and that our plans don't always go as we imagine. And I'm also a lot less stressed. So when I was working, like my stomach was always like tensed up and I had problems sleeping, and that's pretty much all gone now. Um, but one thing that's kind of surprising is that I've lost basically all interest in financial topics.
Hmm.
So when I was leading up to retirement, I was completely obsessed with my portfolio. Every day that was an up day, I would check it and record, my new net worth. And now I kind of have to force myself to check it every quarter just to see what's going on and how many dividends have come in. I rebalance once a year on January 1st, and I do my Roth conversion then typically. Other than that, I just have zero interest in it, and it just runs on autopilot. Um, and I also used to spend a lot of time on FIRE forums, just kind of obsessively reading and sometimes participating, mostly lurking. But I don't do that anymore. I don't read fire blogs much anymore. I'm in some fire groups on Facebook, but they tend to be more tangentially related to fire. Like I'm in a fire book club and things like that. So I think fire for me was like a means to an end. And now that I really feel like, okay, I'm under 2% withdrawal. This is really rock solid. I've kind of lost interest in it.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I've also become freer with my money. So before
Hmm.
I was really obsessive, frugal, optimizing everything. And I'm still frugal, I think, compared to, say the average American, but I'm not like I was. So especially in the area of travel, I'd rather spend just a little bit of extra spend when you're traveling can get you a lot more comfort. And I
Hmm.
think also safety as a female traveler, as we discussed,
Hmm.
which I think is really important.
Hmm. And this expansion of spend was like accounted for, was it, in your fire prep?
Yeah, exactly. I kind of had an upper limit in mind for how much that I would spend. And now I'm trending towards that upper limit. But yeah, I haven't exceeded it or anything.
Yeah, well, if you're under two, I mean, you're still really far under perpetual sustainability. So good on you.
Exactly.
Um, okay, cool. If you don't mind, I'd love to chat a little bit about family, children. You're single, I take it, correct? You're
Yeah.
unmarried.
Hmm.
Was that a conscious trade-off that you decided to make in order to retire early, or if unrelated, what were the factors basically that you considered?
Well, I didn't have kids, but that didn't have anything to do with fire. So if I'd wanted to have kids, I would have had them regardless of whether it delayed my fire plans. I just never had a burning desire, and I think you should have a burning desire if you have kids because, I feel like the world's suffering from overpopulation. So it's better if people um, who truly want to have kids have kids. Um, and as far as not being married, I feel like that kind of cuts both ways because, yes, if I had had a high earning partner who is also dedicated to fire, that would have certainly speeded things up. And I think a lot of fiery bloggers seem to be in that situation. They're dinks, two high earners, no kids, which is I think probably the ideal situation heading toward fire. So I didn't have that, but at the same time, I also um, I could have had a partner who was financially irresponsible and then possibly gone through a divorce that would have been devastating, both emotionally and financially, which would have set me back. So I think, yeah, I think dating is tricky for people in the fire movement because you have to find someone who's compatible, not just in the ordinary ways, but also in the financial ways. And as you know, our culture isn't really geared toward financial responsibility.
So did you make a conscious decision, or did it just happen?
There was no conscious decision. Yeah, it just kind of happened that way. I mean, I'm just like a really independent person and enjoy my own company.
Hmm.
If it happens down the road, that's cool. But yeah, I'm happy. Part of the reason I decided to write about fire in my blog, because I didn't do it for a long time, is because I'd like to be a role model for other single women who are firing, because it doesn't seem like there are too many public figures in the fire community who are single women.
Hmm.
And I feel like it can be really inspiring when you see someone, like you, that looks like you, that's made it happen. So that's kind of why I decided to come forward a little bit with my fire story, and also to be on this podcast.
Well, yeah, definitely. Thank you for coming. It's a really interesting story. Um, so then, when you're traveling, or even I guess if you're not, if you're at home, your home base is like, um, how should is companionship dating? Is that ever an intentional thing, or if it happens, it happens. If not, that's okay. Or it's just like not like totally off the radar screen. Like how does that work for as an single early retiree female, a solo early retiree female traveler? Where's your sort of mind space on that?
Yeah, right now I'm not really looking. I actually do have a companion who's a perpetual traveler, but it's not like a serious thing, I would say. Um, I have seen that there are a lot of resources if you want to find someone in the fire movement. So it's been interesting to me to see those kind of crop up. So there's a fire dating site.
I've seen that. It's a little bit.
Have you?
I was surprised that that exists, but yeah, I'm aware that it exists.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess it was a coding project by somebody that wanted to teach themselves,
Hmm.
how to code a website. So it's pretty basic, but yeah, it's a cool idea. Um, I guess, the usual caveats would apply. I mean, it seems kind of weird. um, you would have to watch out for things maybe like gold diggers, like,
Hmm.
people who want to match up with someone who's already fired so that they have an easy path to financial independence.
Hmm.
Um, there's also a fire singles group on Facebook that's pretty active, and there's even fire speed dating, which is run by a dating coach.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of options now. I mean, there's way more resources, I think, than there used to be. If it's really important for you to find someone who shares your financial values, which I think is common, if you're working towards fire. Although I have to say, my impression of those groups and fire groups in general, but also these dating groups, is that the majority of people are not fired; they're working towards fire.
Hmm.
And the fire singles group on Facebook and also the fire speed dating tend to skew young, so 20s and 30s. So that's something to keep in mind depending on what age range you're looking for.
Hmm. When you're in learning immersion courses, does romance ever crop up? It did when I was enrolled in immersion courses. Like that, it happened. I mean, like not me specifically, but it happened. It was observable. Does that happen for you?
I think when I was younger, when I was backpacking in my 20s, certainly romance and travel sort of went hand in hand more. But now I'm not really looking for that, so no. Um, Not for me personally, but I do observe, well, I mean, at any age, of course, but especially for younger people at language schools, that can certainly be a part of the experience.
Hmm.
But for me, I'm really more interested in, making interesting friends that I can't necessarily, people that I can't meet here,
Hmm.
and making connections that way. So it's not my focus at all.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, you mentioned that you have sort of a casual companion. He's a perpetual traveler. Like how does that work then? Do you just happen to meet up in the same cities occasionally, but otherwise it's all remote? Like how does it work?
Yeah, we both like to travel solo. So we tend to hang out when we're both in town. Of course, now with the pandemic, we've both been kind of grounded for the last 18 months or so.
Oh, you're
Um,
located in the same place.
yeah, we're located in the same place. Yeah, more or less close by.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you don't prefer to travel together?
We have done shorter trips together.
Hmm.
I guess I would be open to going further afield. At this point, though, I've really got kind of my own way of doing things when I travel.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, for me to take on a travel companion would be a pretty big decision. I
Oh.
usually prefer to go on my own and then meet up with people during the day and, kind of have more flexibility that way.
Hmm.
But having said that, I think in some ways it would work well to travel with someone who also is very independent, because then you can split up during the day and do your own thing, get together in the evenings for dinner, and kind of do things that are more fun to do as a couple.
Hmm.
Um, my experience traveling with a lot of people is that they don't want to do anything on their own.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and so that doesn't really work well for me,
Hmm.
but unfortunately I know that I'm the one that's the aberration, you
Mm.
know. Most people would think it's very weird to go on vacation with someone and then go off during the day and do your own thing,
Hmm.
but I think that is probably what I would need for that to work for me, because I just need a lot of space and time on my own. And I love exploring by myself. The only time, when I'm traveling that I do tend to, seek out company, either through, meetup or couch surfing or whatever, in the evenings, it's nice to have someone to go have a drink with, or, a meal with or something. I mean, those are the kind of things that I think are less fun when you do them by yourself.
Mm. 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 Would you say you're an introvert?
I'm a huge introvert. Yeah. I need a lot of alone time and decompression time. And I also really enjoy my own company in a lot of ways. When I travel alone, I feel like I'm just kind of more open. I'm
Mm.
observing a lot. Whereas if you're with someone else, you're kind of distracted maybe by their conversation. You're also kind of in a little bubble with them,
Mm.
a little protective bubble that can be comforting on the one hand, but on the other hand, maybe you're also missing out on some
Hmm.
things, by staying in that little bubble.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'm a big introvert, but at the same time, I love meeting interesting people. So I build in human contact wherever I go, and I think I'm pretty good at meeting people and also maintaining long-term friendships. I'm good at keeping up correspondence with people.
That's excellent. I mean, it's very, I guess, helpful to have a very clear vision of, you know, what your travel style, the things that you prefer, the things that you don't prefer, because uh, then it's easier to like both find others who are compatible if you so desire, or not, if that's a better fit. But one of the things that I know that at least is it is a topic of discussion among early retirees who are long-term travelers, especially folks who are single, is um, the challenge of like dealing with loneliness on the road, especially when you're long-term, you're not during normal travel season, and sort of how do you deal with that? But I guess in your case, it sounds like, well, first you need the solo time a lot, and then also I guess you have the language school communities where when you want to be, and the couch surfing communities when you want to be with people, uh, there's ways to make that happen. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think loneliness is kind of a part of long-term travel if you're traveling alone, even if you're an introvert. I mean, I'm fine being alone 90% of the time, but there is that 10% that, I do need human companionship for sure. So yeah, that loneliness on the road can be intense. It's something that you kind of have to accept, that there, no matter how well you plan, there will be times when you're lonely, and you just kind of have to embrace it, and also, come up with strategies to mitigate it. Some of the things I mentioned, I mean, obviously, the language study is a great way. Um, and then all the meetups that you can do. Um, but meeting new people all the time can be exhausting too. So it's important to schedule like regular Skype sessions with your family at home and friends to kind of stay in touch with people that are important to you. Um, some other ideas that I might explore in the future. So people I've met, I have friends that have done the Nomad cruise. So that's like 1 to 3 weeks of cruising with a bunch of digital nomads. A friend of mine did that, and she said she met the most amazing people and, got a lot of long-term friendships out of it. A group of them after her first cruise ended up renting a house in Brazil and living
Mm,
together. I met someone on Remote Year when I was in Estonia, which is where you join a cohort of digital nomads and you spend a year traveling around the world with them to a new location. I
mm,
think it's like once a month or once every couple of weeks. And then there's Wi-Fi Tribe, which is sort of similar, but it's like a shorter commitment. It's less than a year. It's like month to month. You
mm,
can sign up for these chapters and travel with other nomads. So there's so many options now. Um, that you can explore, and I just really, I know a lot of these things are on hiatus right now. I mean, cruises certainly. I think the cruise company that they used for Nomad Cruise actually went out of business, so that's
mm,
all going to have to be revisited, but hopefully those things will make a comeback.
mhm. I was just thinking about our discussion a moment ago about sort of companionship and having a partner. One of the reasons why people, it's one of the big reasons why I think a lot of people get married. I hope is that you sort of take care of each other, especially as you get older, right? And it may just become harder. How given that you're very happy where you are right now, how have you thought about the later years and how you might um, manage those solo, or if you're not worried about them at all, that's totally fine as well. I'm just kind of curious if how your thinking has what your thinking has been in that area. Sort of right now you're obviously very healthy and young and energetic, etc. Being alone doesn't seem at all like a liability. What happens in the later years in your view?
That's a really good point. um, Couple of thoughts. um, so I think I mentioned, I mean, the women in my family tend to live into their 90s, so they definitely outlive their husbands. So and that tends to be typical for women, is that they end up a lot of times being the surviving partner. So even if I did get married, there's no guarantee that person would be around to help or take care of me when I get older. Same thing with having kids. You can't really rely or even expect children to do that for you. um, so yeah, I mean, it is a concern for sure. It's something that it might cause me to, for example, move to be closer to family as I get older. Um, yeah, I mean, fortunately, you're not alone in this situation. I mean, there's a lot of people. There's services that you can pay for and things like that. Um, one thing I've thought about is maybe moving to Europe. Certainly, if the healthcare situation here gets more dire, it might make more sense for me to move to Europe and kind of be in more of a managed care situation. That might provide more security. Since my parents are German, I have the EU passport, so I always have the option of moving there if I wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. And when it comes to I guess long-term travel, are there any other ways that long-term travel is qualitatively different or feels different compared to vacation travel that you have found now that you've been doing it for several years?
It's definitely different. I mean, when you're doing vacation travel, you're just kind of in this honeymoon period and everything is bright and fresh, and um, you're seeing everything with new eyes. And, like I mentioned, with long-term travel, you start getting maybe a little burned out, a little jaded. Like the sightseeing that you would do on a short vacation trip just doesn't really feel satisfying anymore, for me anyway. And so that's when I think you have to take the next step and kind of find a new purpose to your travel. In my case, it's been the language learning, but people could do volunteering, or you know there's many things that they could do, based on their individual interests. But Yeah, for me personally, long-term travel without a goal and without a purpose feels a little empty. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What would you have done differently, if anything, if you could go back and do it over again? The path to fire and post fire.
Well, like I mentioned before, I started my software career kind of late at age 30. So if I had, at age 17 or 18, if I had decided I wanted to fire, if I had majored in computer science in undergrad and started working right away, I probably could have retired in my mid 30s. But I actually don't regret the time I took off in my 20s to travel and have different experiences. In fact, I would say the opposite. I wish I'd done more of that, even though financially it didn't help me at all. Because when you're in your 20s, it's a different style of travel. I mean, I remember I backpacked around Asia for 6 months with just the stuff in my backpack, staying in hostels and guest houses for $2 or $3 a night, and it was just a very basic existence. It was pre-internet, so this is a different style of travel because you're truly cut off from everyone that you know, and there's no gadgets to distract you. Um, Travel nowadays is a lot easier, obviously. We're so much more connected, but in some ways I have nostalgia for those days. And I'm so glad I had that experience of traveling pre-internet. Um, but one regret that I do have is I really wanted to go teach English in Brazil in my 20s. And for whatever reason, I didn't end up doing it, just like didn't work out. I mean, I think it was, at the bottom, it was like, I think fear of the unknown that stopped me, but I had a lot of convenient excuses as to why I didn't do it. But I wish that I had done that because it would have been an amazing cultural experience. But now now that I can do it, I have no desire to be honest. When you're young, you're kind of hungry and you're willing to do whatever work for not very much pay. And once you're FI, like I said, I mean, it just kind of changes your attitude. And I have at least it did for me. And I don't have any desire to do that anymore. Somehow, not even as a volunteer. I just have lost my interest in that idea. But I still travel to Brazil and I love Brazil. But it's a different kind of experience when you're older. And so I guess my advice to people that are working up to fire is don't wait until you retire to have some of your bucket list experiences
Mm.
because we don't know how long we'll be healthy or when a pandemic will come along and lock everything down for a few years. So I mean, I really recommend taking an unpaid sabbatical from your work or taking summers off from grad school instead of going and doing that internship that will look good on your resume. Instead, go travel and volunteer or whatever you want to do because later it becomes more complicated because you have more responsibilities, but also because the person who you are changes and you might not even want to do that thing
Mm.
anymore. So I'm a big proponent of carpe diem.
Mm. All right. Well, Ingrid, this has been a really thoughtful conversation. I've loved having this chat with you. It's definitely a different one. Where can listeners find out more about you, what you're up to?
Yeah, my blog is secondhalftravels.com. So just all one word, Second Half Travels. And there you can find my early retirement story. Maybe we can link to that in the show notes because it's not necessarily linked off the menu of my site. And also a lot of language learning tips, TV shows and movies for all the languages I've studied and language school recommendations for Spanish and Portuguese. I'm currently documenting my Russian learning journey, and I'll be adding more language school reviews for France, Quebec, and Russia once we can travel again.
All right. Well, we'll definitely link to those resources in the show notes. And thanks so much again for chatting with me. I look forward to sharing this with our listeners.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye.